All right, we're back. And in this segment, we're going to talk about epigenetics. So, the basic definition of epigenetics is the principle that genes interact with the environment. Back in the dark ages, when I was a college student, this idea was just a brand new idea. The idea that your genes were not a hard, fast blueprint that had to be followed, but instead could be modified by the environment or from other genes or from other things was kind of new and controversial. Now it's become pretty accepted. The idea that your genes are mutable, we call it changeable. So again, I already mentioned this in a previous lecture, but the term genotype refers to the genetic code that's being carried in your cells. Phenotype is the term that we use for the expression of those genes. So I thought I'd start with a really simple genotype phenotype issue, which is hair color, and we're going to use a really simple pair of parents where the dad has red hair, so that means he has a recessive trait that he's expressing. So that means that he has two genes, both of them are coded for red hair. Red hair is the least common hair color because it's the most recessive. So only 4% of the world's population has naturally red hair. So I know for sure that if dad has naturally occurring red hair, he has two recessive genes for that. Now, it turns out that mom has black hair, but one of her parents has red hair. So she has one coded gene for black and one coded gene for red hair. So if they were to make four children, the probability is that half of those children would inherit mom's black hair gene and have black hair. The other half would inherit mom's red hair gene and would have red hair because all dad is donating is red. It's really up to mom to determine the hair color of the offspring. So half of the time they would have her hair color expressed and half of the time they would have dad's hair color expressed. But just like we discussed with the X and the Y and the XX pattern, it's important to notice that we've got, dad donating a red hair and mom donating black hair in the upper left corner, both of them donating red hair. Mom just has the one red-headed gene. Dad has two, so he's donating that first rose red in the upper right-hand corner. In the lower right-hand corner, he's donating the other red hair. So there could be variations in the shade of red, let's say. Dad may have one red gene that tends more towards a coppery color and the other red gene that leans more to strawberry blonde color, something like that. So depending on which of his two red genes the child inherits, they may express a different outcome based on being paired up with mom's red gene. So that's a pretty simple one, and it's a really good example of how genotype, okay, these are the genes that the children have, but the expression of those genes can be affected, the phenotype can be affected by something like the environment. One environmental factor that can affect hair color is exposure to the sun or exposure to chlorinated water or salt water can have an impact on the hair color. And so, children who live near the equator might have, lighter colored hair, even though their genotype is for a darker shade. And so it's really important to keep in mind that, really probably your genes set you up for a range of reaction. That your genes say that my hair color could be as light as this and as dark as that, and that the environment probably determines where you fall within that. That's not even taking into consideration like really deliberate attempts to change the hair color, like, hair dye. Obviously, you could just make your hair any color you want by using environmental things on purpose. I'm trying to stick to environmental things that happen to you that maybe you don't do on purpose. I guess maybe you could do it on purpose by, I apologize for that noise. That was me. I forgot to mute my phone. I guess you could say that it's kind of your choice where you live and get exposed to sun, salt, and chlorine possibly. But I think my point is valid that, environmental factors are, could be deliberate, could be, sort of incidental. Now your genes also interact with each other. Let's go back to mom's and dad's red gene. So mom's red gene may code for a certain shade of red. The red gene that dad donates may code for a certain shade of red, and that will help to determine what actual color the offspring has, right? Like those two genes can combine together and produce a different outcome. We call this additive heredity. A good example of additive genetic coating comes in the skin color coding, where the code that's carried on the sperm kind of combines with the code that was carried on the egg to make a mix of what ends up being the offspring's skin tone. Now, that's not always a guarantee. Sometimes the offspring will have skin color that is much closer to dad's, or skin color that is much closer to mom's, or they might be a mixture. That's the thing with additive heredity. You're going to fall somewhere in the continuum, usually between the range that was provided from the dad and the mom. Height is one of these additive heredity things. On average, the height potential of the mom and the dad will combine to produce an outcome that will produce offspring that are somewhere between mom and dad. That's not a guarantee for sure. I know for me, I was like, well, I'm guessing that my children will be between my height and my husband's height. My daughter will probably be taller than me. My son will probably be shorter than his dad. Well, my daughter's shorter than me and my son is taller than his dad. So it's it's not a guarantee. It's just sort of, this is how genes kind of work, is that on average, not specifically for an individual, but on average, the genes will mix together to produce an additive outcome when you have additive genes. Not all genes are additive, but we do have this potential for additive heredity. Other genes follow the dominant recessive pattern. So here we have an example of Eartha Kitt in the middle. She's famous for having played Catwoman on the 1960s Batman series. And on the right is her daughter, and on the left is her granddaughter. And so what you might notice is that Eartha Kitt's daughter seems to have inherited a lot of recessive traits. I can't speak to whether the daughter's hair is actually blonde in real life. I don't know that. But her skin tone is lighter than Eartha Kitt's. I can't really see her eyes, so I'm not sure whether she has Eartha Kitt's eye color or if perhaps she has a lighter eye color. It's hard to tell, but you can kind of get the impression that her daughter has inherited some recessive traits from Eartha Kitt and her dad, from the daughter's father and mother donated recessive traits. And that's how genes work. If a dominant gene is present, that's how a lot of genes work. If a dominant gene is present, it will express itself. And so if there is a gene there for brown eyes, the person will have brown eyes because that's a dominant recessive hereditary pattern. And I have to actually qualify it by saying darker eyes, because typically in eye color, it's not always brown versus blue, is it? There are a lot of shades of colors. And so typically darker is more dominant over lighter. And that's true with hair color. A lot of our dominant recessive patterns, darker is dominant over lighter. And so Eartha Kitt obviously inherited darker gene for skin and darker gene for hair, but was carrying within her recessive genes that she passed on to her offspring. So a lot of times we don't really recognize what our own genetic potential is until we make offspring and we find out. Now, could we flip this? And let's pretend that the woman on the right is the mom and Eartha Kitt is the daughter. Let's pretend that. And let's pretend that, I'm getting all sorts of mixed up incestuous things I'm going to say here for a second, but let's pretend like the daughter and her own father made Eartha Kitt. Let's pretend that. They couldn't make Eartha Kitt because obviously the dad is carrying recessive genes. The mom is carrying recessive genes. They could not produce a person who has dominant genes. If they carried those dominant genes themselves, they would be expressed. So so let's go back to real life. In real life, Eartha Kitt, as the mom, has dominant genes that she's expressing in her phenotype. She carries recessive genes that are not being expressed in Eartha Kitt's phenotype, but that emerge when combined with her husband's recessive genes to produce this offspring. It can't happen in the reverse. I had a student once tell me that she had brown eyes because it was recessive on her dad's side. I don't know what really happened, but brown eyes are not recessive on anybody's side. Brown eyes get expressed. And so I will just say that when they did a study at a hospital in Oregon about 20 years ago where they did DNA testing on parents who were there to have a baby, So they have the mom who gives birth, so we know she's the parent. And then we have the father there who thinks he's the father, and they donate their DNA and they test the DNA of the baby. And in 10% of the cases, the purported father was not the DNA contributor. Things like that happen. And so I didn't say that to the student at the time. I was like, well, that's unusual. Dominant traits don't hide across time, and let her come to her own conclusions. But I'll just say very confidently that dominant traits don't hide like that. And more than likely, she doesn't know who her actual father is. That's the better case. Or maybe she might be adopted altogether. Sometimes when people adopt children, they don't want to tell them that they were adopted. And so they're left with these weird, impossible genetic explanations for how they look the way that they do. So possible for Eartha Kitt to be this woman's mom? Yes. Possible for this woman and a man who has these same characteristics as the mom does to be Eartha Kitt's mother? No. But it's possible if the blonde-haired woman had a mate with the same characteristics that Eartha Kitt has, yeah, they could make Eartha Kitt for sure. Because dominant will tend to appear. Not always, right? Because the recessives can pair up. Oh, genes are so confusing. All right, now I've got 2 pages of known. I'm going to hop back and forth between them. Just I don't want you reading them too carefully because these are known genetic diseases and conditions that have these are ones that might have impacts that are important to us from a developmental psychology perspective. These are not the full spectrum of all the common genetic diseases and conditions. What I want you to notice is the probable inheritance pattern. So albinism, which is where you're born without any melanin. So you have white hair, oftentimes red eyes, really pale skin, can't be in the sun. That's a recessive trait. So it takes 2 parents with that gene. With Alzheimer's disease, it's if you have early onset, it's a dominant trait. So a person who develops Alzheimer's disease prior to the age of 60 probably inherited it, and it was a dominant gene. If it's an onset after 60, it's probably not genetically based, and it probably is a combination of things that we really don't understand. Again, cancer multifactorial, cleft palate, cleft lip multifactorial, clubfoot multifactorial. So now that one I didn't even mean to do. That just happened because I was hovering, I guess. As you'll notice, a lot of these, we go down here to deafness multifactorial, diabetes multifactorial, hydrocephalus, which is water on the brain, multifactorial. Just you'll notice a lot of them say multifactorial, right? That's really common. Really common to be multifactorial with some, part of the factor is going to be environmental. Next most common cause of these genetic disorders are recessive patterns, right? So Tay-Sachs recessive, sickle cell recessive, phenylketonuria recessive. Muscular dystrophy is recessive with some multifactorial environmental factors going in. We've got recessive cystic fibrosis, like almost everything else. So it's either multifactorial or recessive, right? You'll notice that really commonly. We have got the one dominant if you have early onset Alzheimer. We've got another dominant one, which is Huntington disease, which I'm not seeing on the list. Thought it was on this. Yeah, it's not on this list. Huntington disease is another. Huntington's chorea, it's oftentimes referred to. That's a dominant trait. We are seeing down here at the very bottom, Tourette syndrome is dominant, but it isn't necessarily that you'll inherit exactly the same type of Tourette's as your parent did. So usually multifactorial. Next most common is recessive. Occasionally dominant traits will be passed on with these negative outcomes. And so you can kind of see that our genes are sort of set up to protect us from passing along or inheriting a disorder that would be, super damaging, right? Like these are things that tend to emerge if you're mating with people who are really close genetically to you. And so you'll notice that in certain closed communities that want to only mate with other people within their closed communities, they'll have these kinds of recessive traits that emerge, like Tay-Sachs disease or sickle cell anemia, where you end up with, isolated communities or communities that choose to only mate with people who are in their community. They'll start to pass along these kinds of recessive traits. The last thing I wanted to point out was a couple of X-linked disorders that are harmful. The ones I had given you before about baldness and color blindness are really not harmful outcomes, but we do have an X-linked disorder called Rett syndrome that has a neurological component to it that is X-linked, and we also have hemophilia being X-linked, which is where you are unable to clot your blood. So we have a couple that are damaging and X-linked. But mostly we're talking about recessive and multifactorial outcomes when we talk about genetic diseases and conditions. All right, well, that's enough on this. In the next segment, we will move on to chapter 4.